working on a testing guide part 2, which is going to be about pen testing. I'll get onto that towards the end as well. I think one of the most valuable things that OWASP has is we have local chapters. There are plenty of local chapters now. There's over 20. I help organise. Oh, by the way, did I say to turn off mobile phones? Yeah, just make them silent if you really do need to get that really urgent SMS or whatever. The other thing is the mailing list. This is a really invaluable thing. We do get into the nitty-gritties a little bit more than the WebAppSec mail list. Who's familiar with WebAppSec at securityfocus.com? Yeah, cool. You should all be aware of it if you're going to be in this field. I'm also the moderator of the WebAppSec mail list, so I'm a bit biased. I've got foot in both camps. But the overall local chapters mailing lists are a little bit quiet. You've only got 20 people there, but we've got plenty of other activities going on that are project focused. Talking about projects, we've got heaps of them on there. The top 10 is referenced by a whole bunch of people. We've even been linked from various government websites. We're in the Visa/MasterCard/Amex. The card issuers have chosen the top 10 as being a target that if you write applications that deal with credit cards over the web, you get to deal with us. Now the top 10 is in, it's been a little while since it's been revised with the guide coming out. We are in the process of having a look at revising the OWASP top 10. That process is in the earliest stages. My advice is that if you're doing credit card stuff, you should probably use the guide now until we've revised the top 10 again. Saying that, the top 10 is still pretty valuable advice. The criteria is essentially OWASP as a standard. I had an email from a gentleman who's one of the chairs of the ISO 17799 committee, and I'll be probably talking to them a bit further. We may not be going through ISO, we may not be going through NIST, but we're certainly looking to have a standards version of our materials, which will be easy for people to adopt as corporate policy or as governmental policy. That process is stalled. We do need more volunteers in that area. If you are interested, please come and chat to us. Testing, as I've mentioned, is a very active little mail list. We've got a lot of people working there. The guide and the top 10 are about looking for issues that relate to code that exists already or code that you're about to write. The testing guide is about how to find problems at a penetration testing point of view. It's a different aspect. It certainly looks for vulnerabilities and threats. ISO 17799, this is effectively a bit of a stalled project. I'll just go through the other ones. The most interesting from your point of view, if you haven't got something that does a little bit of training to understand the different types of problems you might face, the Webgoat project is a really cool one. It's a very, very vulnerable application. It has at least 45 different types of vulnerabilities built into it. You don't put that on your outside web servers at all, but it's a really good training tool. If you want to learn about Sql Injection, cross-site scripting, or any of those things, it has all those different types of lessons. The new version coming up actually will deploy on platforms other than Windows. The current version requires Windows, even though it's a Java program. Yes, it's a J2EE program, it's not portable. Okay, probably the most interesting one from our point of view of what we're talking about today is the PHP Validation Filters. They're like a hidden gem on our website. If you're doing PHP development, they're great. Effectively, it's the accept known good version of the world. They're really easy to use and they're licensed under the LGPL. This is what you're here for, the OWASP Guide 2.0. Admittedly, I finished this at around 2 a.m. on the day that I travelled to Black Hat, and then I got an email from Michael Howard asking me to revise the cryptography chapter. So I revised the cryptography chapter and re-rendered the PDF at 5:45. I was getting on a plane at 7:15. That newest version of the guide is actually not up on SourceForge yet, but the old version of the guide with the dodgy cryptography chapter is still there. So you can get it today from SourceForge. If you've got the ability on the wireless network, you can get it right now. But I would suggest getting it right now, probably in about the end of today, because I've got the new PDF with the better cryptography chapter uploaded. 3 years in the making, and it's been a long time since OWASP 1.1.1 was released. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but I will put it down to volunteer time is eminently flexible. People have a certain scratch they really want to itch. They've scratched it and then they move on. There is a lot of difficulty in keeping a big project like this alive. It really does require a lot of effort. I'm lucky that I've had a lot of help over the, since I took on the project as guide lead since November. And I'm really happy that the way it's turned out. It's a complete rewrite. The old version was very chatty, it was interesting, it gave you a few ideas about where to go, but all in all it didn't give a lot of guidance. The new version works from the OWASP top 10, but we work in a slightly different way than the top 10. We have a best practices part at the early part of the chapter. We then go into weaknesses that are common in code that we would like you to fix, but if you don't get to them, you've got to decide for yourselves. And then the next part of it is what you would consider the top 10 style, which is the threats that you might face from a motivated attacker and how to actually the countermeasures that are applicable for that. So we go for 3 different styles of activities in each chapter, and you've got to decide what's applicable to you, and we'll get onto that in a tick. Now, peer-reviewed, I really wanted this to be peer-reviewed completely, but the reality is that the last few chapters went in the last week or so, and as per the cryptography chapter, as per the buffer overflows chapter, I'm expecting to see some revisions. We are going to be putting out a new version soon. We're expecting the peer reviews to start flowing in once we've actually got some traction and people have started downloading it. We will talk to you about how to do that, and we'll get onto that in a bit. But the first few chapters, up to about chapter 12 or 13, have been peer-reviewed extensively. That includes the Authentication and Authorization chapter. What's new? We have lots of advice. I think the biggest single change since the 2002 release is that we now are essentially saying you have to do threat risk modeling. Now, there are only 2 things that we really want you to do. You have to do security testing, and we want you to threat risk model. We have chosen the Microsoft threat risk modeling process. We do detail other threat risk modeling processes. We're not terribly fussed which one you use, although we do talk about the Microsoft one a lot. You just have to choose one. The reason for this is that effectively, if you actually sat down and used all the controls in our book, it'll cost you megabucks. There is no way that a piece of software should use all of our controls. We're here to do secure business, not to comply with a checklist. That's why there are no tick boxes in the OWASP guide. We don't want you to tick every box. We want you to tick the boxes that are suitable for your software to a certain level. There are different levels of control. There is no point on a forum software to go to the nth degree on strong authentication, because that's not their model. That's why we don't want you to actually use this book and then go tick. Credit card processing. I had an interesting discussion with some of the Visa people just before they released the PCI guide a year or so ago. I wrote a credit card processing chapter for it, for the OWASP guide, based upon what we think that web applications would most likely use, and I've normalized that against the PCI guidelines. If you are doing credit card processing, you should read that chapter, but most of all, you should grab a copy of the PCI guidelines, which I've referenced, and read about them. We have anti-phishing chapter in there, and that has been peer-reviewed by some people from the anti-phishing working group, which I'm also a member of. It has about 13 or 14 things that you should do. It's essentially all process. There's only about one thing in there that's actually technological, and it's got nothing to do with WebAppSec. It's Sender Policy Framework. Essentially, if you put an SPF record in for certain countries like Australia, pretty much everybody's in the top 5 ISPs. You're covering 95% of the population, and they all use SPF. Not the second part that Microsoft have actually developed, the bit that might have some patent overhead, but the bit that's out there in the public domain. If you do that, the likelihood is quite good that you'll actually, like for countries like Australia that have a very limited number of ISPs and a large number of clients within them, that eliminates a lot of phishing mails directly. Doesn't work in every country. That's why we want you to read it and apply the things you think you might be able to get around. If you're an ISV, most of those controls just are not applicable to you, because you're not the people who are actually going to be the victim. You're not going to be the people who are going to have the customers who are going to be victims. So you can skip the chapter. But have a read of it anyway. It's pretty interesting. Best practices for secure development, unit testing. We want to do different types of testing. The next version of the guide, we'll talk about this in a bit, we'll actually have a chapter on this completely. We have every single chapter that has technical content, has COBIT headings. We did this for a very simple reason. We wanted to have the guide being useful for the people who are doing SOX compliance. SOX is actually a relatively simple, straightforward law. It just simply says that senior management has to believe in the efficacy of the financial controls for financial systems, so that things like Enron don't happen again. Particularly for IT programs, just because no one uses double entry book ledgers in pieces of paper anymore. Effectively, what this means is that organisations are using SOX to implement IT security for the first time. They're not doing it very well, but what we're trying to do here is help you figure out which parts of SOX which part of COBIT, which is the usual set of controls that people are doing SOX compliance use, are useful. So every chapter has at least 2 or 3 bullet points there. Gives you something to have a read. Of course, you'll need to go and grab the COBIT standards, the control framework, to understand what we've actually pointed you to, but typically people who've got a need to do this have that. Hey, web services. We have a web services chapter written by Dennis Pilipchuk. He's written a book on web service security already. He's had some articles out there on Java. Very, very cluey guy. The chapter is pretty long, talks about WS security, talks about XML, XML desig and its friends, the encryption and whatever, and lots more. The chapter is about 30-something pages long. If you're doing web services security, you should certainly check it out. What's improved? That's what you're really waiting for. Effectively, although the guide's increased it's changed from about a 90-page book into a 278-page book. The number of controls goes through the roof because we are actually dealing with things not in this is a nice, chatty, friendly volume to, control how to find the problem and then how to actually fix the problem. So there are so many more controls. We really don't want you to, as I said, do them all. You've got to choose those that you need to do based upon your threat risk modeling. If you do your threat risk model, you'll figure out that, okay, I might have an authentication issue, or I might have an authorization issue. You read through the authorization chapter to make sure you're caught up with what you might need to do, and then go and fix it. Authentication. The authentication chapter is the one that was given the most attention. There's about 30 controls in there. The best practices are essential. Effectively, this time we've gone for dealing with high-end financial apps because we believe that username and password days gone. Effectively, what it does mean, though, we do give some advice on how to actually implement password security properly. But we essentially believe that unless you're doing something like, for example, forum software, username and passwords are just the wrong solution. Okay, so we talked about strong authentication, and part of the bottom bit is from a phishing point of view, you want to sign the transaction, you want to sign the user in. One-time passwords for those little tiny fobs, they don't really help you if you've got a browser open and someone does a phish and all of a sudden a transaction's occurred. They didn't approve it. What you really do need to make sure is the user's approving transactions, and so if you're doing high-value transactions, and to you have to define what high-value transaction is to you. I'm working on a system at the moment that's going to do $3 billion worth of transactions a day, and so we are going to have transaction signing using challenge response. So we also talk about basics like CAPTCHA. Now, CAPTCHA is basically a really bad idea. You have to have a method of signing in that's accessible. They don't work, and we do talk about them a little bit. They've got a little tiny section down the back, but just in case you were designing a CAPTCHA-based solution, you're thinking it was a good idea, we do introduce the bad ideas as well to make sure that you are aware of what the issues are. Authorization. This is one of the areas where web apps generally fail pen tests, because what normally happens is that people don't think about every single type of authorization that may be required. The fact the user is logged in doesn't necessarily give them the right to access a piece of functionality. You'd be surprised how many applications fail because they don't check the access before they do a transaction. This is actually really important, particularly for administrative interfaces. If you know that a particular transaction is available for an administrator with a particular URL or a particular post, if there's no authorization code in there to make sure that you're, for example, an administrator, the likelihood is very high that you will be able to do administrative type actions. We look at that particular issue. The chapter is actually very short. It's only about 12 pages long. We look for things like client-side SSO tokens. We look for things like administrative interfaces, and we do have some advice for you there that administrative interfaces, and we've got an entire chapter on them, should be separate. Session management. This is one of those things that is really important. Most web apps go for two different ways of handling them. The vast majority of PHP applications don't use them because generally hosters haven't set up the session handler properly. Most Java programmers don't use them for a different reason. They believe stateless is best. Now, that has a particular mindset that essentially says, well, stateless is best. I'll just send all the security tokens back to the user. That's really not a great idea. You've got to balance those two out. Clever handling of session management is key to a secure application. We also look at session fixation properly and HTTP split session attacks. Now, admittedly, that particular issue and HTTP request smuggling are not really about session management per se, but web app taxonomy has a lot of platypuses. Platypuses, if you don't know, an Australian animal that is a mammal that lays eggs. It has a bill as well. So effectively, we have many things that straddle different areas. We just put it into the right one from our point of view. It probably won't migrate too much, unless, of course, there's a huge reason for it to move to somewhere else. Error log auditing. If you're doing financial applications, and typically people who are spending the time to do code reviews really are doing those sort of e-commerce, banking, high-value systems. Doing logging correctly is really important. I am not in the belief that logging everything is the correct way to do things. You want to log signal, you don't want to log noise. The best way to log signal is to understand what is actually important to the business. We go through that. The last thing we actually do inside this chapter is we look at systems that are inappropriate for logging. For example, audit records have to have some form of integrity checking in them. If you log your audit records to a syslog server, it's just unauthenticated UDP. Anybody can log any crap in there. If you put it into a world writable log file, the likelihood is very high that someone could tamper with that log. You've got no proof that that log is actually going to stay around. We do try to encourage you to spend the right amount of money on the right type of logging. We do sort of suggest to go towards centralized logging, but the main reason we do that is to get the logs off systems that are relatively easily compromised. It is not for log correlation or analysis. It is generally for safety. You want to have those logs in another location. Now, most of the tools that do those log centralization stuff, for example, syslog and something like BMC Patrol, are security nightmares in their own right. You've got to make sure you don't introduce one problem when you're fixing another. This is a section, we're getting into sections now that have been completely and utterly rewritten. Data validation. It is a complete and utter rewrite. The main aim of this particular section is to encourage you to stop using those older style validations. We no longer think that sanitize is the correct way of going ahead. You really should be doing accept only good. If you know that you're only going to accept, say for example, numeric things into a field, say for example a currency field or a postcode or a zip code or whatever, that's what you accept. Don't try to sanitize it. If it doesn't make the grade, tell the user, sorry, it didn't work, try again. Much, much safer. I'll show you why in a little bit. We do actually have some other advice in there as well. The actual data validation chapter is reasonably short. It's only about 10 pages long. But we do go into things like delimiter characters. In the old guide, we only had a few, like null bytes and carriage line, return feed, and things like that. What we're really looking for is, we're looking for anything that actually delimits a transaction or delimits something in a special way. I was working on a system not long ago where, well, it's a mainframe, and the code that was actually being used is COBOL, and it was written in the 1970s. It was interfaced to an XML front end, and then that was fronted off a web service. And sure enough, if you injected the Xslt character for end of file, it believed it was the end of file and stopped processing. And all sorts of interesting things occurred. So what we're really looking for is your system may have hidden an unusual terminators. You really need to understand what those terminators are so you can handle it properly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Interpreter injection. This is the new heading for what used to be Sql Injection. There used to be a chapter for just Sql Injection. We have a whole bunch. User agent injection. We actually talk about all the different types of cross-site scripting. The reason why we call it user agent is that the attack actually occurs on the user's browser. You might help that attack by being a little bit weak. We actually talk about the three styles of cross-site scripting. Immediate, like the reflected sort, where a user is pushed to a redirect, which is typical of phishing attacks because they have to come from an email. Doing a HTTP post is a bit tricky. We talk about stored, where the actual XSS is put in there, and then at a later stage, another user comes along and then sees the nasty content. They're the usual two. We also have the newest one by Amit Klein, which is the JavaScript attacks, and they are classic. So we've got the DOM one in there. At the moment, there is a lot of software out there that really isn't that protected against DOM cross-site scripting. So if you think about those Lotus Note servers and whatnot that have 100 kilobytes of JavaScript before you actually see a single thing on the page, all that code's got to be audited to make sure that it's safe against this type of attack. We do, of course, deal with Sql Injection. We've referenced off a whole bunch of papers. This particular chapter is not designed to teach you how to do Sql Injection. The previous one sort of was a bit confused about that. What we're trying to do is teach you how not to be vulnerable to Sql Injection, and then we've referenced off to papers that teach you about how to actually do Sql Injection. So what we've actually aimed to do is actually reduce the length. So if you're actually a solution designer, architect, anybody who's actually setting up coding standards, you can actually learn the techniques that prevent them, or at least make them very hard. And then you can go and read them about how bad and how often they actually occur. ORM protection, injection. Things like Hibernate and Spring are built upon database systems. Database systems have Sql Injection. ORMs that are built on PHP, for example, deal with MySQL on a regular basis, and they really don't filter any of the content that comes in there. So if you're thinking, yep, this is an ORM, you can't really do a traditional Sql injection, well, that's absolutely wrong. This section talks about them. We do deal with one particular aspect of Hibernate, which is the session.find. It is a depreciated interface, but plenty of code still uses it. If you are going to use Hibernate, Spring, or any of those ORM-style models, you've got to be aware that it's not impervious to injection. OWASP command injection. This is what is typically called not code injection, but just sort of, second-order injection, where you might be doing a batch, you might be directly executing a program. Code red effectively was it's a multifaceted threat, but one of the things it did do was actually run commands on the box via the URL. Code injection. This is actually a big problem for PHP and a lesser problem for ASP.NET and J2EE. Both J2EE and ASP.NET can do evaluation, but you have to go out of your way to do it. Most code does not contain examples of it, so you're reasonably safe. However, PHP has the eval tag and a whole bunch of different ways to re-evaluate live dynamic PHP. We look at this and we essentially say, well, you've got to make sure that you're reasonably safe when you use eval. We don't want you to actually just go ahead and use eval as if it's just a nice little candy on the side. Ldap injection. Reference off a few papers there. Again, it comes down to making sure that user input does not go into Ldap in an unsafe way. Because Ldap is generally used on the front page of many large-scale apps, you really do need to make sure that username and password fields are Ldap injection safe. Xml Injection. We look at three different forms of Xml Injection. We look at normal Xml Injection, where you're putting in additional nodes in, or trying to change additional nodes. We look at XPath. XPath is an excellent injection target. It is a standardized query language. One of the cool things about XPath injections is that you can do exactly the same things as you can do with Sql injection, but no one's changed the language, so it works on every implementation. And of course, Xslt, which is generally used for templating. Lots of report writers use it these days, and plenty of people have got those little pop-ups saying, what style of report would you like? And they actually refer to template names. Well, it does expansion. Many of the PHP examples, for example, can pull in remote Xslt style sheets, and you can include any file. You've got to be careful about that. We do talk about it a little bit. Mechanicalization. This is one of those areas that doesn't have a lot of effort put into it, and it simply comes down to not a lot of people that really spend a lot of time doing Unicode stuff. But it's not just about Unicode. There are many different types of mechanicalization. It could be file system, it could be UTF-8, it could be HTML encoding. We talk about them all, and we essentially suggest to you some strategies to work through it. There are no foolproof ways of getting around all forms of mechanicalization. I'm sorry, but that's just the case today. The best bet is really accept only known good. If you see characters that you didn't expect to see, such as %, the likelihood is quite high you have some sort of a dodgy input. We do suggest that you assert a correct locale. If your application is UTF-8, that's great, but if it's not, assert the correct one. Set up the char set properly, set up the user input in accepted languages. The reason for this is that your web server gives you a free hand. It actually goes out of its way to convert at least once if you've given it the information it needs to work with. But just remember, the client can resubmit in any locale they like. File system. This is a great one. We look at dangers from file-based operations. For example, lots of... Yeah, that's actually one of the controls that we suggest. And in fact, in file system, CH rooting is like pretty much, it's almost in every one of them. The question was, would CH rooting or effectively virtualization of the directory structure under the Windows model, would that actually help? And the answer is yes. It would reduce the amount of area that you could go to and do damage, particularly for Xslt type templating issues. Okay, file system. We've got another one. Yay, permissions. We look at permissions. It's no longer acceptable to simply give people an application and hope that they'll get the permissions right. We want you to actually go ahead and deploy with the best possible permissions. We want you to actually give advice to your users about what permissions work best. So spend some time when you're actually working on your application to make sure that they're good. Indexing. Insecure indexing was a paper that was put out by ANET a little while ago. Effectively, this is like Googling your desktop. If you've got a search engine on your website, the likelihood is quite high that it might index things you didn't actually expect. We just talk about it a little bit. But also we talk about controlling search engine behavior, but you've got to realize that attackers don't obey robots.txt. The best bet is not to have content you're really worried about on the servers. Temporary files. These are a classic. The way you deal with temporary files directly correlates to how well you'll survive. For example, if you're generating a PDF report and you're generating it just with a predictable name, the likelihood is very high that someone else could predict other people's, other clients' names and get that report. We really do need to understand what the benefits and difficulties are using temporary files. Our advice is, if you don't need to generate a file directly, like if you can create the PDF in memory using PDFlib or something similar and stream it out to the user, much safer than generating a file and then getting the user to use a static include on the web browser. Buffer overflows. This chapter is likely to get revised in 201. It needs a little bit of effort, but the likelihood, the thing is we wanted to cover it off. 2.1 will have an additional chapter as well. We'll talk about that. We go through all the majors. The reason why we talk about this is that every web application framework lives upon operating systems written in vulnerable languages. Most operating systems these days are written in C, C++, or assembly language. The compilers have traditionally not been able to produce stack-guarded code. That's changing, and certainly we're seeing a real reduction in operating system buffer overflows, but people are still producing code that has real issues in this area. Even if using .NET or J2EE or even PHP or Perl, which generally don't have buffer overflow problems, if you're calling something that might, sending a big buffer into a web application is still an interesting exercise. It works surprisingly often. It's worthwhile making sure that you know the behaviors anyway. We go into the different types of buffer overflows that you might experience, and we like to actually make sure that, our benefit is to go through here and say, shorten the amount of stuff you send to them, make sure that you don't send old or unusual things to them. Buffer overflows don't have to be 4K in length. They can be just 1 byte bigger than is needed. Administrative interfaces. When I do pen tests, and I do a few, not as many as I used to, most of the days I do code reviews these days. They are far better, but we won't go into that. Administrative interfaces are the highest risk part of the application. Typically, all the effort, developer effort and designer effort is spent writing the main app, and the administrative interface is a collection of interesting tools strung together to make it work. Security is often not a strong point of these interfaces. What we want you to do is stop making them a sort of side project for when you're bored. You've got to make them a tier 1 component of your application. And more to the point, they should not be a part of your application, they should be somewhere else. If you can separate these interfaces out, not only do you become SOX compliant, it actually helps a lot in reducing the risk from these applications, even if they are not well written. Security through obscurity is no longer good enough. You just can't have /admin and it's not linked anywhere. You've got to make it a little bit harder than that. And of course, if you're doing an application that processes more than about, say, for example, $150 worth of transactions a day, you owe it to your users to make administrators use strong authentication. I know that, for example, strong authentication tokens cost like $20, and the actual infrastructure that surrounds them may cost you a bit, but the reality is username and password is no longer acceptable to administrate web interfaces for applications that do credit card processing and other forms of e-commerce. Cryptography. This section is the one that I got the feedback from Michael Howard just before I had to go. There is a revamped section on this. The new version of the guide with this particular section will go up onto a SourceForge today, so I'm expecting to be able to use the wireless the wireless network sometime today and put it up. We look at how to select algorithms. We don't want you to select poor algorithms today. We don't want you to pick up stream algorithms. We don't want you to use dodgy things. We're basically saying choose AES, choose SHA-256, or better. We also look at key lengths. One of the things about key lengths in there is that there are very few reasons to go over 2048 bits for certain types of keys at the moment. We look at the reasons why you wouldn't choose even that length. Moving right along. Michael's comments on stream ciphers. We didn't have stream ciphers in the book until like 3 o'clock on Monday. That's fixed. It's there now. We look at support secret storage as well. One of the problems that a lot of application servers have is that, for example, Java application servers and PHP application servers, your applications have credentials in configuration files that clear text. Anybody who has local access to your production boxes has direct access to your data. Now, if you've got, say, for example, encryption turned on in your database, that doesn't really help at all because someone on your front end can just simply retrieve the data in an unencrypted form. We want you to handle your cryptography a little bit better than it is today. Privacy, we go into privacy. Effectively, what this section is trying to do is improve trust. Users will only use you if they believe that you're actually acceptable. To give you an idea, I used United Airlines. I'm going to rag a bit on United here for a little bit. I used United Airlines to book my ticket to come here. They redirected me to a non-United domain to actually process the transaction. And it was very amateurish. And honestly, I thought I was being phished. And it was only the fact that the certain things matched up and I was able to book actual seats. And I still didn't have a lot of trust in it. I was really worried about making that booking and completing it. When you do your application, really think about how the users trust your application. One of those things is keeping it within your own domain. I am going to provide feedback to United because I really do feel that, even when I confirmed my ticket, I didn't really believe that United had actually made the booking because the credit card statement had a different name than United. It's like, come on guys, this is not hard. Anyway, we look at the various laws. You do need to actually worry about this because if your application is used worldwide, there are different laws available. We do prefer people to actually have not the least common denominator approach, which is the US laws, but choose laws that actually make sense to protect your consumer's privacy. It doesn't kill to do these things. Okay, configuration. Configuration is a new section. Effectively what we're trying to do here is remove the attack surface area. Put it right down. For example, there's a particular forum that I look after, XMB. we've actually turned off most features by default. So most forums probably won't get around to turning the vast majority of these features on, and you won't be able to attack it because the feature's not turned on. That's something that worked for the Windows group, and if you ever attend any of the Microsoft SDL presentations, which I heartily recommend you do, have a look at how successful they've been at reducing the total number of very severe or critical bugs, and you'll find that the vast majority of them have been dealt with by just simply turning stuff off that doesn't need to be on. We don't want default passwords. We don't want default counts. There's no reason to generate them, and effectively your users should have an ability to put them on by themselves. We don't want clear text in configuration files, and we want to make sure that RDMS and middleware connections are done securely by default. Effectively, the biggest sites in the world probably have an excuse. They have performance issues when they use encryption. But for everybody else, by default, they should be encrypted. We should definitely be aiming to make sure that, by default, the vast majority of the applications that are deployed out there are reasonably safe. We have a PHP chapter. The reason why we did PHP first is, well, it needs it. PHP made almost every choice wrong. And they keep on making more and more bad choices. When people, I've actually been on the PHP website where they develop PHP and looked at mailing list. Every time someone suggests that they may want to choose something like allow URL if open to be off by default, there's shouting and yelling and all sorts of rubbish that goes on for months and months and months, and eventually, after a really severe exploit that exposes pretty much 90% of all PHP applications, they fix it. It should never have been allowed. PHP, by default, is a very insecure thing, and unfortunately the vast majority of people, although things are getting better in PHP version 5, hosters aren't deploying it because many applications don't work with it. So you're stuck with this older version of PHP, generally 4.3.9 or 4.3.11 if you're lucky. And many applications are written very, very poorly. If you turn on all, you just get all these errors everywhere. So we've written a chapter. Hopefully if you follow this chapter, you'll produce much more secure applications. The next version of the guide will have ASP.NET and J2EE guidance. The reason why we do these chapters is not to repeat the main text, but to actually give specific advice on how to avoid things in those languages. For example, if you use J2EE and struts, you really don't have an output XSS problem because J2EE by default really helps get rid of them. ASP.NET in 1.1 and 2.0, you can't do XSS by the URL by default, but you can turn it on if you want. You don't want to do that. So we're going to have different chapters for those different things. Robert Hansen, who's Arsnake, I don't know if Robert's in the audience today, but certainly he was very gracious in allowing us to reproduce his cheat sheet. It's, I think it's about 27 pages long, and it's got 95 different ways to do XSS. It's an amazing resource. I really recommend that if you ever wonder about the sort of things you might be able to get up with XSS, it's a huge, huge thing. I will just show it to you. It's a classic. There's Mr. Mouse. Oh no. It's Acrobat Reader. We'll be here until tomorrow. Open with preview. You're not going to see that very easily. What I might do is I might bring that back to here so you can see what I'm looking at. There we go. Anyway, basically from page 274 to page 290 has just so many wonderful cross-site scripting. It's all good. There are just so many different ways of doing it. It's great. Love it. Now, does using the OWASP process actually work? The reality is most applications are not developed with secure coding in mind, and when you do penetration tests, usually the day before it's due to go live, which is an unfortunate fact of life for the average tester, you find plenty of things that are repeated time and time again. That's one of the reasons we wrote OWASP, is to prevent coding getting to that stage. You should never get to, T-2 and find out, hey, your application's riddled with security errors and it's going to take 5 months or 12 months to fix it. XMB. This is a forum that I actually helped write. When I first came to it, it was just your average PHP forum. It had plenty of faults in it. We were getting probably 12 to 15 things were popping up on a regular basis and bug track, and it was really quite annoying. There were defacements happening everywhere. For some reason, XMB was heavily defaced by Arabic defaces. And the interesting thing is that XMB, until the very next version of XMB, does not actually support Arabic. So I'm just wondering why they chose XMB. But yeah, well, just letting you know, XMB, the next version is called UltimaBB, and it supports right-to-left scripts, which is really cool. I fixed it. I went through using the OWASP guide. I did a top 10 review to start with, and then I essentially went through and fixed up all the other little problems, and over time, the code has become fairly invulnerable. We changed a lot of the way, I don't know if how many people here use forums? How many people here use forums at all? A few. Forums have this particular type of HTML-like code called BB code. And the idea is that you do BB code instead of HTML because, well, HTML is injectable, don't you know? The reality is BB code is just as injectable as HTML because people who wrote it didn't think about the except only known good aspect of it. They did, let's sanitize, let's take all the rubbish out and let's make it a little bit simpler, but they still allowed things to get in there. For example, the size tag in many PHP BB code implementations allows alphanumerics in there, yet it's only supposed to allow -1, -2, 0, and +1, +2. It's not supposed to allow anything other. So I went through and I changed all the BB code to allow just what I'm supposed to allow. If you only allowed 8 colors, well, you're only allowed to use 8 colors. You weren't allowed to do any more. Most of the other forum software out there still has this let's sanitize approach, and it's really injectable. So unfortunately, all those other people have to catch up to where XMB is today. We've only had one problem since May 2004, and they found it in the U2U subject. You could actually do an XSS to yourself. If you had a blank subject, you could do a XSS to yourself. So it wasn't exactly the most critical of all problems, but that gives you the idea that we really did go to town and try and fix all the XSS problems. It is not perfect code. If you go and attack it today, you will find a few problems, but hopefully when UltimaBB, whatever version it's going to be, turns up, that'll be a lot better. Now, for those of you who actually use PHP-BB, I'm a member of the security auditing team there. They started it after 2.016 came out. I tried helping them at the beginning of the year, but, well, I was shouted at. I was shouted at really rudely by the fanboys that inhabit their website. I found that very disappointing. If they themselves don't want to have security, it's not for me to say that they don't need security, but I share my host with many other PHP-BB wards, and I was sick of having my host restoring the database because someone had compromised PHP-BB yet again. So, luckily enough, I've been invited along. You'll definitely want to apply 2.018 coming up in a few weeks' time. Let's just say that. What's next? Guide 201. We do expect to have a whole bunch of little bugs, the peer reviews that didn't really occur. We want to have that feedback. We need to make that feedback good. So what we'd like you to do is pull down a copy of the guide, start reading it. If you have a particular interest in an area or think it's woolly or doesn't really help you, please tell us. In particular, shoot it either to the OWASP guide mail list or alternatively shoot it directly to me if you don't want to subscribe to the mail list. There's plenty of fixes and edits that even I'm aware of. This is a hard deadline. We had to finish it for here. We did do that, but unfortunately I know there were some issues with it, so don't expect pure perfection. Every single paragraph is shine to the last particular dotted I, crossed T. We are working on that. But if you do find something, do tell us. It is 280 pages, so I must admit I have not read it cover to cover for some time. We're thinking end of August. I think that's pretty good to get a first 201 out there. Guide 2.1. We don't want to have such a large gap between releases from here on. We're going to try for a few more. We don't really want to have overload for you, so it's difficult for you to track us, because that's a problem where, say for example, PHP for example, is now having, well, they've had 3 or 4 releases in 2 months, which is very hard to keep up with. Standards should not change that often. So what we're doing is we're coming up on around the November timeframe. There's a reason for it. We're going to be published. We're actually coming out in hardback or soft cover, we don't know yet. Soft copies will still be available. No Starch Press will be doing the work. They've assigned us an editor, and I'm actually meeting with one of their people today. So we're looking very chuffed about that. It will have all fixes. The 2 chapters that didn't make it into 2.0, there was a deployment chapter and a software quality assurance chapter, which we'll talk about in a tick. They will actually be in there as well. Secure deployment. Unfortunately, this just didn't make the cut. There wasn't enough content in the chapter to finish it in time, and honestly, we don't want you to have a bad chapter just to make a particular deadline. So 2.1 will have the secure deployment chapter and the software quality assurance chapter. Testing project. The testing project is the alternative to us. It is essentially how to do pen tests. It turns all the controls that we've worked on and works for you to figure out how to do pen tests in a quick and effective manner. The membership plan. This is a new thing that we're actually coming up with. One of the things that's been noticed is, and one of the reasons why it took so long to come up with this version of the guide, it was impossible for us to actually develop the guide in a timely fashion because we don't have the resources to do it. What we're trying to do with the membership plan is for, if you make your living using OWASP materials, we strongly request your desire to fund us. We have a membership plan available on the website today. It's not that expensive, and honestly, compared to most standards environments, we are very, very cost effective. If you're an organisation that doesn't like free licenses for whatever reason, you can actually dual license it, which is an option that's not available to everybody else. Of course, everything is still open source, and we still encourage open participation. You will not have to be a member to help, although we do encourage it. Individual memberships are very cheap, but if you go to chapters, we will strongly be recommending that people who go to chapter meetings will become individual members or corporate members. We have some new infrastructure. We've got wiki and forums and blogs. Of course, these supplement our existing mail lists and everything like that. They're available from our website as of today. Okay, our last slide, and then I'll take questions until 11. It is 10:53 at the moment, so we've got 7 minutes for questions. And then there's a break, and I believe there's coffee and snackies outside. What we'd like you to do is pick up a copy of the guide, review it. It does need good, solid peer review. It is actually quite usable today, but it is a .0. It is certainly something that if it was a piece of software, you'd probably be a bit dodgy about deploying it. But we do think that it's much better than 1.1.1, and it should become your gold standard today. We want you to threat model your solutions. Whatever you've got today, start thinking about doing threat models. They're not hard to do. They don't take long to do if you do them from the very beginning, rather than doing them well after you've actually finished writing the software. Review your code and fix the problems. There's so many different areas. If I was doing a code review today, I'd start out with the data validation chapter and then work on injections. That gives you the breathing space to fix the rest. Okie dokie, that's it. Questions? And remember, prizes. Yep. Sorry. Yep. Well, effectively, we call that plain text equivalent, and we just think it's an obfuscation step. Effectively, if you do need to do something like have the key on the same disk that needs to be encrypted, the likelihood is quite high that a local attacker will be able to do that. It does actually suggest that there's no reason for the front-end web service to have that key. You can encrypt towards it using asymmetric type encryption, where you've broken the key into two parts. You can encrypt it, but can't decrypt it. That's probably the best solution for front-end web servers. If you need to have that shared secret there, you've lost. Yep.
And how did OWASP become reference directly to PCI standards?
That might have been me. There was just literally nothing else. The Writing Secure Code book at the time was the best book on writing web apps securely, but it was so focused on Microsoft technologies that people were passing it by, which is, I think, a mistake. The first third of Writing Secure Code was a great book, but people didn't really think about that as being, that's the standard we need to stick to. The top 10 was relatively easy for people to pick up. It did actually address the top 10 vulnerabilities in 2002 and 2004, and when I was talking to the people at Visa, they seemed to be happy with it, and it got in there. They didn't even tell us when they finished writing it. They didn't ask us to peer review what they had actually put up, but I'm pretty happy with the result. Cool. Questions? Yep. Yes. Effectively, we essentially give you the advice to make it work. Unfortunately, the vast majority of PHP applications are written very poorly, and they're deployed in hosting environments. Most hosters really don't know how to have a secure implementation of PHP. I think it is actually possible to have secure PHP. It's just unlikely. Okay. More questions? Okay, thank you. Oh, no, sorry, down there. But even Java Key Store has got a clear text credential to unlock it. As there is actually something to deal with, like WebSphere does it using obfuscation. They actually have an XOR method that allows you to obfuscate the password. There's no better way to describe it. BEA has an equivalent, but the reality is, if you're doing Jindy names or anything like that, Jindy names are literally a key into a queue. So Java's got a lot of clear text stuff like that happening. ASP.NET's not a great deal better. Even Trusted Connections, which is one of the solutions we come up with, or suggest, that puts it into the LSA store, and the LSA store is just obfuscation yet again. So honestly, there isn't a great way of dealing with it today, and the main one is to realise that those configuration files are very sensitive and need to be locked down, and that's one of the key suggestions we make. There is actually something that was on SourceForge a little while ago dealing with Java and J2EE configuration files. I'm just trying to remember its name. Come and see me at lunchtime or something like that, and I should have had a chance to find it again. But it's a good question. It's really hard to do. Really, really hard. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. I like the question over there.